Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the webinar. We are so glad you're here. We have a lot of super exciting things to talk about. Today's webinar is about powering up your SharePoint with Power Apps and Power Automate. We are Spindustry, and we've been in the business for 25 plus years, and along with our SharePoint work, we provide several other services. After today's webinar, you'll receive the link to the recording and the slides. If you have questions at all during today's awesome webinar, you can use the question feature and we can get those answered for you. My contact information will be on the last slide of this slide deck, so if you don't get your question answered today or you think of any in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. Besides today's webinar, we do have a lot of others that are free and easy to access, and you can find those on spindustry.com/webinars. My name is Kelsey Culbertson, and I will be your host for today. And along with me, I have Tavon Graham and Jared Edge. I'm going to turn us over to Jared, and he's going to tell us what we're talking about today.
All right. Welcome, everyone. We're always happy to put on webinars for you. We took some time to talk about what really should we present this time as we're going into Power Automate and Power Apps. And we recognize that a lot of our clients have this need, and we want them to continue to grow their environments. And so let's talk about Power Apps and Power Automate today from a bunch of different perspectives. So as we put this together, we thought, what is it we should give you? So we think that there's going to be a lot of people on here. Some of them are going to be new to Power Apps and Power Automate. Some of them are going to be advanced Power users and have been working with it for a while. So we wanted to cover both aspects of it. So we are going to give several best practices as we move through this entire agenda that we have. So just be looking out for those, and we'll try to point them out as we go along. We'll also look at how to get started with Power Apps and Power Automate. We'll look at how to use Power Apps in SharePoint if you want to enhance list forms. So we'll go through that. We'll look at the different types of Power Apps that there are and their use cases. We'll look at the different types of Power Automate flows there are and their use cases as well. We'll also see how the integration works with other Microsoft 365 applications as well. And then we didn't have it advertised inside of the agenda that you saw when you signed up for this, but what kind of webinar could we have if we didn't have Copilot inside of there somewhere? So we will be also mentioning Copilot along the way, and we'll talk about how Copilot works inside of both of these environments as well. We'll also throw in Copilot Studio and talk about the importance of that with your data governance and such. So that's where we're going today. Hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jared. So the first thing we were going to talk about is how to get started with Power Automate. But Tavon, before we jump into that, could you kind of tell everyone what Power Automate is? We do a lot of these webinars, and we never like to assume, that everyone knows what something like Power Automate is.
Yeah, for sure. So hello, everyone. I'm Tavon. For those of you who don't know what Power Automate is, right, it is a kind of workflow engine that lives behind the scenes of all of your Microsoft 365 applications, right? So it can talk to all those different apps we have, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's OneDrive, whether it's Word or PowerPoint or Teams, any of those pieces of the suite. Power Automate lets us do some automation there. And think about that from your own day-to-day lives, right? Are there little processes that you have that you just don't want to have to go through manually anymore? Some very common and simple use cases for things that Power Automate can do might include notifications, right? Maybe we want to be notified when an item is about to expire or it's up for review. Maybe we want to send something to our manager to approve, like a SOP that needs to be approved. We'll look at a couple of those simple use cases here, but just bear in mind, right? Power Automate is a very easy thing for you to start using and to start getting some value out of.
Very nice.
All right. So to get us started, I'm going to take you out here to one of our SharePoint environments, and we're just going to look at a library, right? I mentioned a couple of things there that you might want to get some pretty quick value out of yourselves. One of the most common things we hear is, man, it would be nice if we had a contract management system that let us know a few months in advance when something like a contract was about to expire. In this case, let's look at that from the perspective of SOPs that need to be periodically reviewed and updated for a company. So the absolute easiest way that you can start getting some value out of Power Automate is going to be to go to one of these libraries where you have some of that data you want to be notified about. Just hit these three dots up here at kind of the top middle of the page. What you'll find in here is we have a couple of menus, right? We have Automate and we have Integrate. Let's focus on Automate for now. So this Automate menu lets us actually leverage some of those automation capabilities of the platform. In this case, I'll say let's set a reminder for this SOP expires on, right? That's a column that you see here tracking some of these dates. If I just click on that, we'll wait for this to load. It can take just a quick second, but it's really spending this time thinking about what that flow is that it should make because we're trying to get a reminder on a certain column. So this menu might not look familiar to all of you, but this is kind of Power Automate or Flow really trying to tell us all of the services that it's going to use for this automation that it's creating, right? It gives us a brief description of the workflow that it's making, and it tells us, hey, I'm going to need access to SharePoint. I'm going to need access to an app called Notifications, where it can actually let you know about the app that it's or workflow that it's putting together for you. And it's going to need access to this service called Office 365 Users, where it can read information about you as a user, figure out your email or other things that might be relevant to that notification. So if I just say continue, it'll ask me a couple of basic questions here about how I want this particular flow to be stood up. It'll tell me I can give it a flow name. In this case, we'll say get an email reminder works, but let's also tell it a little more specifics about SOPs. And it asks us how far in advance do we want it to notify us when an SOP is about to expire. Maybe I'll say, just let me know 5 days before that expiration happens. And I'll click create. And what that's doing for me is it's actually making a workflow in Power Automate, right? So let me take you over there so we can just see exactly what that put together for me.
And I
So
think it's also important to say at that point, a user, so someone who's just starting out in this, an end user, really would just stop at that point. And then they would see, they'd expect the email to come to them in a couple of days. But someone who wants to get a little bit more involved in it or go see what happened behind the scenes would then really want to come to here where Tavon's going to Power Automate to be able to take a look at what it's actually doing behind the scenes. Even if you didn't change anything, I think it's still a good step for even a beginner to just go to Power Automate, take a look at, did it create something in the background for me instead of having to sit there and wait for that email in 5 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at this screen that you'll have in front of you now, what we're looking at here is the Power Automate designer, right? This is the workflow designing experience where we can actually see what one of those flows is or customize it. So just by clicking those couple of buttons in SharePoint, it put together this entire workflow for me. It figured out that it should have a trigger type of recurrence. We'll talk more about that later, but it just means this will run every day at about 3 o'clock. It was kind enough to initialize a variable that it's going to use to build a table and notify me in a nice, visually pleasing way about all of those SOPs expiring in 5 days. And notice right here that it gave us a place that we can actually change the days to remind me in very easily. So maybe when I first set up this workflow, I thought 5 days was good enough. But maybe I'm using it a little bit more heavily, and all of a sudden I want that to be 15 days in advance. It notifies me. Just by changing this one value, I've gone ahead and actually updated the amount of time out in advance that it'll notify me. And some of these things you're seeing here are actually best practices for building a flow. Right? We'll talk more about that later on, but it was very intelligent of Microsoft to put this right here, this days to remind me, rather than making us actually dig through everything else that the flow is doing to update that value. All right. So it also has in here another best practice we'll talk about a bit later on, where it actually tries to let us know if anything had gone wrong throughout the execution of this flow run. And we can take a closer look at that functionality later on as well. But again, this is a well-built flow that we didn't have to do anything to get stood up other than just click a couple of buttons.
Yeah. So, and I would say, Tavon, there's probably some even advanced users out there that haven't used like the scope um, uh, piece of that, right? And so, even for an advanced user, being able to go look at some of the simple workflows that are just generated by Microsoft or even generated by Copilot, to be able to come in and take a look at some of the things they're using, and then question, oh, why are they using a scope there? What does the scope actually do? And then reading a little bit more on that to figure out how to use it. And like Tavon said, we're actually going to show you, because we feel like that's a best practice, but we're actually going to show you even a better way to take advantage of scopes inside this environment. Excellent.
Absolutely. All right. So because we're talking about some of these simple automations, right? It's also worth mentioning that there are other ways that we can use automation on our lists and libraries in SharePoint just with the click of a couple buttons. One of those you saw in this same automate menu. It's called rules. Now, rules is a little bit more simplistic than the set a reminder workflow, but it can have a couple of other triggers to it. So let me go ahead and create a rule here, and I'll just show you what we're working with. So these rules, again, are really focused on kind of notification, right? So notify someone when data in a column changes, notify someone when a file gets created or a file is deleted. I'll go ahead and say, let's notify someone when a file gets deleted. All right. And here I can choose kind of who I want to get that notification. Am I notifying myself? Am I notifying someone who I specify? Like I can put in a name here and it'll actually send them the email. And I'll just click create. Now notice, right, these rules are, again, simple. I don't have any control over what that notification actually looks like. I don't have any of those wonderful variables we can configure like we saw with Power Automate. This is not really a Power Automate flow so much as it's just something native to the list for a very, very simple reminder you don't have a lot of control over.
Yep, that's awesome. So, just to let everybody know, you will get the slide deck that we have here as well, and we did put a slide in here that shows kind of most of the buttons that Tavon clicked on to be able to do that simple workflow that you have. So you'll have the video, but you'll also just have this slide deck if you want to kind of use it as a reference for yourself.
Awesome. And that slide will look something like this.
Awesome.
All
Perfect. Thank
right.
you so much, Tavon. So the next thing is to talk about how to get started with Power Apps. But again, I kind of want to do that thing where we take a step back and tell everyone what Power Apps are.
Yeah, definitely. So if a Power Automate workflow is about making things simpler for you by automating some of the work, a Power App is more focused on your experience as a user, right? The vision behind Power Apps is that you should be able to customize the way that you work, whether you know how to write an app yourself or not. Power Apps and Power Automate are what Microsoft would want you to consider low code or no code solutions, where we can get something up and running with just a few clicks of a button. That's not to say that knowing some code practices won't help you, though, and we'll learn more about that with Power Apps.
And I think that's actually really important to keep saying over and over, that low code, no code experience, because that is Microsoft's message. Microsoft's message for having both of these products is so that citizen developers can go in and create things. I didn't have to grow up or go to school to be a developer to be able to get some things accomplished. But within that same message, I think it's safe for us to say, hey, this is great, but you can do simple things, but there's a lot of times when you're like, well, I wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to do a little bit more. And you do need to understand that developer mentality, if statements, like if this happens, then do this. If that happens, then do something else. Or, what's the best approach to make things more efficient? Those are type things that you want to be able to learn. So I'm not saying that everyone here needs to become a developer. I'm saying use it for what it is. Use it, and when you get to that point where you can't go a little bit further, reach out to the community, because, or Google it. And the community has a lot of information out there that will help you go forward, right? But it still should be low code or no code, right? It's very simple, or simple enough to be able to figure out. That's what the hope is here. So that's why we're bringing this to you today.
Awesome. Awesome. So, because it's intended to be that low code or no code solution, right? There are some very easy ways that you can start getting value out of Power Apps. So, the easiest thing here, I'm just in a SharePoint list, again, in one of those demo sites. The easiest thing we can do to start using Power Apps is just to click this Integrate button. And you'll find that Power Apps is listed, right? Now, it does mention a few things here. The one that I'm going to click on for you first is this Create an App. But just to look ahead, notice this Customize Forms is also there. So if I hit Create an App, right, what this is really going to do is it's going to go ahead and put together a basic Power App for me so that I don't necessarily have to be in SharePoint or on that list in order to get some value out of where we were keeping our data in SharePoint. So here it's taking me out to the Power Apps studio where we can actually customize the app that it built. But as soon as it's done putting this together, before we actually change anything, let's look at what it actually puts together for us. So I'll just click this little play button up on the top right to preview the app. Okay. So the first thing that's worth noting here, right, is it made this particular app for kind of a smaller screen size, right? This looks like a mobile app, doesn't it? And that's one of the cool things about Power Apps that we'll come to learn as we talk, right? Is that these apps can be made to go with you onto any device. But again, notice that this is my real SharePoint data from that list we were just looking at. It has all of these tickets that have been submitted. It's telling me a little bit of information about the tickets. I can click into one of these, like everything is loading slowly today was this ticket. And if I just hit the edit button up here, I can actually use, again, that full SharePoint list, right? If I change this to not be urgent and I say that it was actually an account issue and I go ahead and say, let's save that, it updated that record. And that change reflects over in SharePoint. So this is really, truly letting me interact with my SharePoint data from anywhere that I happen to access this Power App.
Yeah. And how many times has someone asked us to build like a facilities maintenance app or something like that, which is really just a form of ticketing as well, where a user could actually be somewhere in one of their facilities, open up this app, take a picture of a broken window, and then submit it right there on their phone, and it ends up in a SharePoint list behind the scenes. This is the power of it. It's an app that didn't exist, or an app that I would have had to purchase from a third party somewhere that might have way too much functionality. And I can just tailor that to what I need, and boom, Bob's your uncle, and you're good to go. So this is powerful. We want you to just kind of stretch your minds a little bit to understand that these tools could be very valuable for you inside your organization.
Absolutely. And one more thing that I'll point out here before we look at some other uses for Power Apps, right? We made this entire app with one click. It might have some things in it that I don't want, or maybe it displays things in the app in a way that I don't like. Well, this is truly just a starter for you, right? We are in the full Power App Studio where I could say, hey, I didn't want attachments to be something that I can work with when I'm editing an item. And I can just go ahead and remove this attachments piece, right? I can say right click and delete, and boom, all of a sudden, if I hit my play button, attachments isn't here anymore. Not only can we remove things, but we can also add so much functionality. And we'll take a look at some of that in a few minutes here.
So could I add like maybe a way to do cascading dropdowns?
Absolutely, right? And that's one of the
Cool.
most common uses for Power Apps when it comes to enhancing your SharePoint experience.
So could I add like maybe the ability to take a picture?
Yeah, 100%. Like you said, we've seen many different apps built like that. And maybe you're an organization who wants that picture to be stored somewhere in SharePoint, right? We can definitely have this app put it either in this same list or a different library.
So could I reach out to another third-party app that we have? Like say we have a facilities maintenance application out there, but I'm trying to make an easy way for people to access that without having to have additional licenses on that app.
Absolutely. And that starts to talk about the connectors piece of the whole Power Platform puzzle. We'll show you more about that later, but just about any service you can imagine or anything that has an API, Power Apps and Power Automate can talk to.
Oh yeah. Now we're stretching out people's minds. All right, cool beans. Let's keep going.
All right. So I will take us over here to this list one more time, and we'll talk for a second here about other things that we can do with Power Apps in a list. So we've all used a list in some capacity, or many of us have used lists in SharePoint for one thing or another. We've all seen this little add new item button. Right? If I click on this add new item, it'll pull up a little form for me. This is the new item form that we're all used to seeing and used to working with. If I was to click on one of my items, it'll pull up the display form or the edit form, right? All SharePoint experiences we're used to.
And if anyone's wondering why ours is opening up in the middle of the screen instead of coming out from the side of the screen, your environment may not have the update that's coming, which we're going to talk about just right now.
On the subject of updates, right, one of the cool new things coming to lists inside of SharePoint is this Forms button. So I'll talk more about how to actually work with one of these forms in a second, but let me explain the concept behind it and why Microsoft put it here. So one of our most common questions that we get asked, or most common uses for things like Microsoft Forms, is we want people to be able to submit information, but they should not be able to come back through and see it. Or they shouldn't have real access to a list, right? Maybe this ticket list is something that just our IT team or just the facilities team should ever be able to get to, but someone else should be able to actually submit a ticket into the list. Well, I mentioned Microsoft Forms a second ago there, right? And that's kind of been the solution for years, is let's just create a Microsoft form or a Power App, and we'll have the person fill out that Microsoft form. That data will be picked up by a workflow and moved over into this tickets list for our IT team. That has some downsides to it, though, right? There are some drawbacks to Microsoft Forms. They can't actually interact with all of the types of columns that SharePoint has. There is no managed metadata for a Microsoft form. There is no user lookup for a Microsoft form. So the community has for years been asking for a better way, and that's where Forms comes in. So just clicking on Forms here, you'll find that if I was to go ahead and create a new form or work with one that we already have, right, this is truly the representation of my SharePoint list. So it has those choice fields on it, right? Ticket type was a choice field on this list. And because this form is tied to that list, if I update the amount of, or the choices that are in this form, it's going to reflect in this form, right? So if I add a new option here, like I said, instead of SharePoint laptop and account, I want a fourth option. I wanted it to say, I don't know, facilities as our fourth option, right? Because I made that change, now the list will recognize it. And that works the other way around as well. If I made that change to the list itself, then the form would recognize it. Once you'll find in here again, a user field, right? Things that Microsoft Forms hasn't been able to do for us, but this new Forms button actually can.
So this is amazing because this merges those two efforts together. And I can do this as an end user now. So as a person who just owns this list, I can do that without having to understand how Microsoft Forms works and without having to be able to create a Power Automate workflow to connect those two pieces together. This is just sitting here for me, and this is literally amazing, everyone. So this was a good effort on Microsoft, and I fully appreciate them taking on this to actually put this in here. Is a good item. So there's a couple of caveats though, Tavon. Tell us what those little caveats are inside of here. That's things that aren't here yet.
Sure. So the main thing that's worth really thinking about is who can fill out this form. Right, so when I click the Send Form button, you'll find that I can copy the link. But for those of you familiar with how SharePoint sharing works, this text right here might seem pretty familiar. People in industry or this environment with the link can respond. Right, that tells us that anyone in this org who happens to have a link to this form can fill it out. They can get data put into this list. Microsoft has heard the feedback on that, right? People want to have a little more control over who can actually fill this out, but that's not a thing quite yet. The other thing to really take note of is that this form, its only use is putting information into the list, right? Inserting new records. When it comes to actually displaying information to a user or letting someone see their own responses, this form isn't going to do that for you. And that is where Power Apps starts to come in handy, right? Modifying the form experience on our individual lists.
Awesome. Thank you for all that info, guys. That's so good.
So let's go give them a quick example of editing the actual form in Power Apps.
All right. So again, here we're just going to hit this integrate button and go down to Power Apps, and you'll see customize forms. If we click on that, it'll again pull up for us the Power App Studio, where we'll actually be able to modify the form that we'll see in SharePoint. So that app that we made before, when we clicked Power Apps and create an app, that was a standalone experience, right? I didn't have to be on this list in order to see that app that it made. This form that we're customizing truly lives on the list, and we'll show you how to get to it in just a few minutes here.
And that's also important for admins to know. So if you're an administrator in here, you can control, that form that's attached to that list. This doesn't get attached to necessarily a user context. So Tavon creates it, Tavon leaves the organization, all of a sudden this form stops working. That's not going to happen with the form version of this, right? Now, and we had this question: what happens if Tavon created an application or Tavon created a flow and Tavon leaves the organization and we deactivate his accounts, right? Well, that could interfere with how the organization works or how other people are gaining access to it. We'll talk more about that over in the best practices, but this way it's very, very safe. You can change this SharePoint list form, and it's very, very safe because it's actually in the context of the form, not in the context of a specific user.
Absolutely. And again, notice that this is just the full Power Apps Studio that I'm using to customize this form, right? So if I wanted to add something like an icon here, maybe I wanted to display just a little bit better that this assigned team member field here is a user field. So I'll just put this person icon next to it. Or maybe I wanted to remove this attachments piece of the form, right? We can just go ahead and delete that. Or even pull in data from other sources and services, or any of those expressions you might be used to writing to make your Power App work exactly how you hope that it will. They can be used here. Think back to those cascading drop downs that we mentioned, right? Power Apps handles that beautifully, whereas SharePoint doesn't. Because this is a full Power App, we can have that same functionality.
Yeah.
So in order to actually push this new form to the list, I'm just going to go up here to the top right and click this little publish button. When I click on that, it'll say saving to Power Apps, but really it's going to publish this app customization to the SharePoint list. So we can just go ahead and hit publish to SharePoint. Now, if we go back to this list and I'll give it a refresh, make sure that's a hard refresh for me here because we're kind of doing this on the fly. There we go. So what you'll find is if I click on one of these items and wait for it, it's starting up that Power App. It's going out and getting the data, and it added in that person icon for me right here on the form. Right? Same thing with our new form. This now becomes that same experience. So we're using this one Power App to customize the new form, the display form, and even if we go over here and edit, the edit form, all on this one SharePoint list.
Awesome. Can we take a look at the list settings so I can show my admins here how to go ahead and undo what's been done?
We sure can. So over here in list settings, if you go to this general settings and look at the bottom option, right, we have form settings. So I'll just click on that for us. And here you'll find that not only can we change back to the default SharePoint form by just clicking this button up here at the top, but we can actually get into modify that form from here or see past versions of that customized Power Apps form, all from this one place. So I'll just tell it, go ahead and change back to that default form, click OK. If we go back to our tickets list here, what you'll find is when we go ahead and hit new, again, this is just a normal SharePoint form now, right? Attachments is back. My custom blue person icon isn't here. So it's really that easy to remove one of these forms from a list when you don't need it there anymore.
Awesome. All right, let's turn it over to Kelsey.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of that, can you guys go into the types of Power Apps and their use cases?
So we absolutely can. So in order to show you the different types of Power Apps that we can create, I'm actually going to take you out to Power Apps. There is a slide in the slide deck that'll break these down for you, but I think it'll be better just to show you. So from here, I'm just going to click Create. over here on the left. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and create a blank app, start from scratch. And this will show me the 3 different types of Power Apps that exist, right? The first one worth knowing about here is this blank canvas app. You have the power to decide if you want that to be more phone oriented or more full screen oriented. But these blank canvas apps are really just that. They're a blank canvas, right? You can do anything that you want there. You can access any part of that Power Apps development experience and build an app that truly does everything that you're hoping that it will. We mentioned that facilities maintenance app or a audit app, right? In order to build those the most effective way and have complete control, I would start with a Canvas app so that we can do anything that we want. The second type of Power App available here is what we call a model-driven app. That's created in this blank app used or using Dataverse section. And take note of that about these model apps, right? They really love to get their information from a tool called Dataverse. Dataverse is just a database technology that exists in your Microsoft environment. We'll talk more about that later. But they really, really, really want to be connected to Dataverse rather than other data sources like SharePoint or like any of those other apps.
Yeah. Which doesn't really mean you can't still use, API calls to all those other types of things. It just means that Dataverse will be connected to this, period.
Absolutely. And the third type of app here that I want to mention for you is a Power Pages website. So if any of you have heard of things like WordPress or other low code or no code website builders, this is kind of Microsoft's answer to those, right? Where we might want an external facing site that looks more like a website than a SharePoint site does, but still lets us interact with our data that we have in the Microsoft world. Again, this really loves to get its information from Dataverse, but we have a lot of options with it. Now, I will mention that these Power Pages websites can come at a extra cost, right? So they're not something that's free for you to use. But in those cases where you're wondering, gosh, does Microsoft have any options for us about letting kind of anonymous users get to a small section of our environment that we've customized like a full website? Absolutely.
And then I might think about it from a point of view of, let's say you wanted to build like a little customer portal that interacts with some of the internal data that you have, where you can control what they're allowed to see and how they're able to interact with it. But you might have them log into that site and you can store those credentials. It has a mechanism for doing all that as well. So it's just being able to maybe extend your internal information or your intranet, if you will, or all the pieces that are behind the scenes, extend that just a little bit to allow someone to come in and interact with you, right? And so it could be valuable for some organization. Yes, a definite additional cost, but also model-driven apps are going to be additional cost or a premium type service as well. And Tavon will talk about that as we go forward. He'll show you that as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again starts to talk about those connectors, right? Some of them are premium, come at an extra cost, and we'll show you that a bit later on here. All right. So when you get this slide deck, you will find that we have a slide in here that kind of gives you Microsoft's breakdown of those model-driven apps versus Canvas apps. The thing that I want to highlight here, there's two, is data platform, right? Model-driven apps, they love Dataverse. They don't really enjoy working with those other apps. We can work around that, but that is really what they want to get their information from. Canvas apps, however, they can get their data from anywhere. Do they still like Dataverse? Absolutely. But maybe I have information in SharePoint or a completely third-party service. These apps can work with it. And also look down here at this responsive piece. So model-driven apps, they're going to be responsive by default. They will automatically orient themselves in a way that works no matter what device we're looking at those apps from. Canvas apps, on the other hand, because we have so much control over them, we can change everything about them. If we want them to be responsive, we have to know to build it that way.
Yeah, and for those who may not know what responsive is, because you don't live in the web design world, that means when you go to a website and you can look at it and it looks really nice on a desktop browser, but then you take that and you size it down to look at it inside of a cell phone or a tablet, it still represents all the data really well. It just resizes the content for you automatically to display it slightly differently. So those are responsive apps.
Perfect. Okay, now let's do that again, but for types of Power Automate flows and their uses.
All right. So again, you'll have a slide in this slide deck that kind of breaks some of this down for you right here. But I think it might be better if I just go ahead and take you out to Power Automate and actually show you what some of those different types of apps are. So let me go ahead and get that pulled up for us. And what we're going to do when we come here to Power Automate is I'm just going to show you where the creation experience of a workflow starts. So I'll go to My Flows and I'll hit New Flow. So I don't need you to worry about template or Visio template with those, right? If you don't want to fully customize your own workflow, there are some templates out there by Microsoft or by the community. But what we're really interested in are these options under Build Your Own from Blank. So let's start with Automated Cloudflow. What it really means when it says Automated Cloudflow, right, is that this workflow will be triggered based on something that's happening in the world, right? It will automatically respond to an event. That can be something like a new response was submitted to a Microsoft form. That could be something like an item was created in SharePoint or modified in SharePoint. That can look at other services as well, right? Planner, when we got a task assigned to us, an RSS feed, Gmail, when an email ended up in an inbox. Google Calendar, Azure DevOps, there are countless services that could potentially trigger one of these automated cloud flows to respond to whatever's happening in those other apps.
And again, I think that's important to tell everybody here as well. It's not just SharePoint items that I can interact with. It's not just Office 365 items that I can interact with or respond to. It could be third-party tools that you have like Monday or anything else, Jira or some of those things that are out there, or even Microsoft Teams, which is, obviously an Office 365 piece. But it's very nice to know that it's not just one source. And this, for those who are making a switch from, say, old SharePoint workflows to what we do now, that's a huge difference in it. What I can react to and what I can interact with within my flow.
Absolutely. All right. So if that's automated cloud flows, right, let's talk about instant cloud flows. Whereas automated flows are listening for a event in the world to happen, these instant cloud flows have to be explicitly triggered by something, right? Maybe that's that we click a button on the Power Automate mobile app that says, I want to run this workflow. Maybe we have a Power app that triggers this workflow in a particular instance, right? Maybe someone clicked a button in the app to do it, or maybe a value was changed and that actually triggered this workflow. Note here that Copilot can also run some of these, and we'll talk more about that later on, but that's a powerful, powerful thing for you. But we can even go as far as saying we selected a message in Teams, run an app or a workflow against it. We can say SharePoint, we selected an item or a file, run a workflow against it. Or even listening for HTTP requests from any other service or any other app that you might have built in your life that you want to trigger one of these workflows so it can handle all of the Microsoft pieces for you. All right.
Awesome.
And then the third type here that's kind of worth knowing is the scheduled Cloudflow. So what this type of trigger really says is something needs to run periodically, right? Every certain number of minutes, every certain number of hours, days, months, seconds, we want this flow to run. Nothing has to tell it to run, and it's not listening for any event to kick it off. It just says, okay, it's been a day since I last ran. Let me go ahead and kick off this workflow.
Yeah.
And that can be a very powerful thing.
Yeah, so if you
when it
think about
comes
it from like
to
a server admin or a network admin who's been running jobs or timer jobs, so we're waiting for midnight and that timer job will kick off and go do things. Well, now you have some options to you inside the Office 365 environment by using a flow that's a scheduled flow, and you possibly could then run some of your items via this as well.
And even for those of you who are thinking about this just from the perspective of a user, right? We made that workflow earlier that notifies us when contracts are about to expire or SOPs are about to expire. That used this trigger. It told the flow, run every day. checking this list every day. And you have the same power in any other workflows that you might want to build.
Awesome.
All right. So with all that said, right, we also wanted to mention a few best practices and useful things for you to know about when it comes to building some of these Power Automate workflows. So let me take you over to a flow that we have sitting out here that uses several of these. So just to introduce the use case for this particular flow, right, you can see its name up here in the top left, submit vendor for approval. So over in one of our SharePoint sites, we have a list of approved vendors, vendors that our users can spend money with. Well, we need someone to approve those vendors, right? When someone enters something into the list, it would start out as pending. Then maybe we have the ability to kick that vendor through for approval.
Yep, and to be a little bit more for that, just because we're talking about the same subject, we actually have a Microsoft form that someone actually fills in to request a new vendor, and then a workflow behind the scenes adds it to the list for them because we don't want them to have access to the list. That's pretty cool. So then this kind of picks up as well. Go ahead, Tavon.
Right, right. So that list is something that only our kind of IT team manages, but they need to still get approval, right? Maybe only a person from IT can actually approve these items. So here we're using one of those instant triggers for a selected item in SharePoint. Someone clicks a button on that item and it kicks off this approval flow. So a couple things that you might notice here immediately, right? Just looking at this workflow. One of them is this kind of collection of purple things with a little X as their symbol. What this workflow is doing before it does anything else is it initializes some variables. One of those is debug emails right here. This is who should be notified if this flow fails for any reason. If something goes wrong, who do we want to inform about it? Here I just have my email put in. But we could have multiple in here. Again, this is just a string type variable, so it just holds on to text. Now, why does that kind of become a best practice for us? Right? I mentioned earlier when we were looking at that flow that SharePoint stood up for us about a notification. I don't want to have to dig in order to find where I'm supposed to actually set a value. Right? I don't want to dig through my flow in order to find the places that I would tell it who to notify if something went wrong. Or think about that from the perspective of sending an email in multiple different cases, right? Maybe we only want to modify that email body one time and have it reflect in all three of those different cases where we actually send that email. That's the power of variables, right? Set it up the once and reuse it however many times you want to inside of your flow.
Yep. So for my developers that are out there, you guys are already familiar with working with variables inside of all your code because you put them there for reusability. We find that a good practice is to set up all those variables as close to the top as possible when it's possible to do that. And then for those who are new, just think of this as making it clear of what your workflow is kind of doing and what your workflow needs as information inside of it, and being able to set that in one place and have it be reusable. So that's a really cool thing. But Tavon, I want to point out one more thing that you did here. Like you were able to go straight to the debug emails and you knew it was that because you renamed these actions and put good readable names on there. And that's another best practice we want those who are starting out to be able to do.
Absolutely. And renaming these actions is very, very easy for you, right? You just hit the three dots and you can rename. I would encourage you to do that with every single action you ever put into a flow, because the names they come with aren't going to tell you the intent of that action. The default name for this was just initialize variable. Okay, great, but that doesn't tell me what that variable is, so I can go right to it. All right. So another thing worth knowing about is what we refer to as a scope in the world of Power Automate. If you look a little bit lower here, you'll find that I have these three blocks that are kind of orange and they have a weird little box as their icon, right? Those are what we call scopes. Scopes in Power Automate are just a way that we can actually group actions together. We can group things into one of these scopes. So if I click on try here, you'll find that I have three actions inside of it. And if I click on condition, that expands into further actions. But this can be a very, very useful thing for you when it comes to organization and readability of what your workflows are actually doing, right? Because I could put another scope inside of try here. I can go several layers deep into that hierarchy of scopes and make sure that anyone else who has to come through and figure out what this flow is doing has an easy time finding it. Because again, we can rename these, right? I could have a scope inside of here that we call something like get approval. And I could have this start and wait for approval and this condition that actually checks how that approval went inside of that scope. That's a great thing for you to start taking advantage of. Now, if I scroll down just a little bit further, right, let's talk about this catch and this finally, those other scopes. So just to make this a little easier, I'll collapse try. So before we can talk about catch and finally here, notice these little downward pointing arrows between all of the steps of this workflow, right? The way that Power Automate loves to work is sequentially. It likes to say, okay, the first thing that I do is I get triggered by this selected item. Then I'll initialize this variable called flow name. Then I'll initialize this variable called debug emails, and so on, right? It goes down this chain and it tries to do everything inside of that chain. What we've actually done here with catch and finally, you notice this little eye icon, is we told it a different way to think about that particular action, right? It won't run it necessarily immediately after the action above. So that's using something called configure run after. So if I just click on this with catch here, you'll find that it says, okay, this block, this catch, this scope should only run if try, failed, got skipped, or timed out. What that really means is catch, right? It's looking for an error, something that went wrong with try. If nothing went wrong, we'll skip catch. We'll go down to finally. If something did go wrong, then this kind of block of actions, this scope that sets up our debug email, should actually run for us.
And I
And
think
that's going to be
again,
right.
this is one of those super important things. So we have some developers on here that I know that are on here, and they may know if they're doing JavaScript or if they're doing C# or something else. They know what a try catch finally is, and what they've stumbled across is like, how do I get that to work inside of a Power Automate flow? And so the secret here is, and the secret sauce that we have is that you have these scopes. And I mentioned that because you could actually set this up as a template and then use that same pattern all the time to be able to make sure that your code runs under the guise of a try catch finally inside of there. For anyone who's new, then this is great for you as well as you get started and as you start to mature in what type of Power Automate flows you're running. This is something we just want you to look at. This is a good way to do it. My flow might work if I don't have the try catch finally, but I may not be able to do the error handling inside of it, right? So when something goes wrong, flows normally just fail. But here we're going to say when something goes wrong in my flow, I'm going to catch that and I'm going to notify the people that need to understand it that something went wrong with it, right? And so that's really, really awesome stuff. Go ahead, Tavon.
Awesome. So the next thing that I want you all to be aware of as you start to go a little further into your Power Automate journey is connectors, right? We mentioned earlier that these connectors kind of exist, but what does that actually mean? So if I just click here to add a new action, it'll load for a second, but this is going to pull up the full list of absolutely everything in the world that Power Automate can do. And that is a very extensive list. I won't read these to you, but just looking through here, right, you'll find that it talks to a bunch of first-party apps from Microsoft and hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of external services. Even things like, if I search here for Monday, right, we've all heard of Monday, there's a connector for it that we could use to actually interact with data in Monday. Whether that's creating something, reading something, removing something, we can do it. Now, that being said, as much as there are thousands upon thousands of these connectors, and they all have different actions in them, sometimes you'll find they don't do exactly what you're hoping for. Or you might be working with a service that doesn't actually have one of these connectors set up. In cases like that, right, we have this custom button. And here I've just got one custom connector in this environment that was a test, right? It talks to the Graph API in order to do things like send a message to any Teams chat as a particular user. And that's pretty cool stuff. But you can set up these custom connectors for anything in the world. If it has an API, it can have a custom connector. If you can make a data gateway to it, it can have a custom connector. And then these workflows, these automations, and these Power Apps can all actually talk to that other service.
So that's awesome. So Tavon, you talked about scope, you talked about variables, you talked about the run after, and you just talked about custom connectors. Can you, I think another one that we have as a best practice, which actually will be very valuable to some of the developers that are already here, the people who are using it, is the difference between update items and HTTP requests and how that can help them out.
Sure,
Just
sure.
gonna hop in real quick. We have 10 minutes remaining.
Excellent. Thanks.
All right. So just to briefly explain what we're talking about with update items versus HTTP requests, right? Here I'm using two different actions from that SharePoint connector. One is an HTTP request on the left, one is update item on the right. Both of these will do the same thing because of the way that we have them configured. They are both going to go update the vendor record in SharePoint when we get to this point in the flow. Let's start by looking at this update item, set vendor to denied. So this is a really, really good experience as a user, right? I told it the site to go to, the list to go to, and then I could just fill in all the properties with how I wanted them to be updated. That's a great thing for you if you're beginning to use Power Automate, or you're someone who doesn't want to look too deeply into how the HTTP requests work, right? It's a really good editor. However, there are some drawbacks here, right? The only thing that I wanted to update about this record was the approval status. But notice that it made me put in a title, because title is a required field in SharePoint. It's also got all these other values on here that it might actually be trying to set to something, or it might not, right? Depending on the type of column, if we leave it blank, it can actually end up erasing data that was in that column. It won't always, but it can. So here with this update item, I had to do a lot more than I was hoping, right? In order for this to work really well, I should probably be getting the item's information again right before I send this update, so I have an accurate title. And I should probably fill out the rest of these columns even though I'm not trying to update them. That's where the HTTP request starts to become pretty handy. Now, I know for those of you who are not developers or don't know too much about code, this looks a lot scarier. But this allows us to be much more particular, right? Down here, what I'm doing is I am updating just that approval status value and setting it to approved. I'm not potentially blanking anything out. I'm not messing up the title or having to reset the title because it's required. I can tell this action explicitly what it's doing. And for those of you who want to look a little deeper into how Power Automate can interact with SharePoint, this HTTP request is going to be your best friend, because there's a lot of actions out there already. But these, the HTTP request, can do anything at all that you might want to do in the SharePoint world, even create new subsites.
Awesome. Awesome. So thank you for that, Tavon. I want to ask one more question to you. And that is, we've looked at Power Apps and we looked at Power Automate as well. And let's go back to governance here for those who are here in the capacity of we're about to onboard some or start letting people use Power Apps and Power Automate. What are some things we should look out for governance wise? And I think the biggest one would be, who creates the flow and what should you what rules should you have? What governance rules should you have that says after a flow has been created, what do we do then, right? Because we could have a scenario where I created it for a department. I'm just a normal user. You allowed me to use Power Automate and Power Apps. I created something for my department. It's been working for about 6 months, and then I leave the company. I win the lottery. I move to a different department, even, or something like that, or I just reset my password, right? So tell us some guidelines that you might put in place or that we normally put in place with our clients.
Yeah, so you're kind of, you're getting at the best thing that we can do for a Power Automate workflow there. And that is really consider what account is that workflow going to live on, right? Because as a user, can I make workflows? Sure. Can they interact with a whole bunch of the suite? Absolutely. But maybe we don't want some of those critical workflows to live on a user account. Maybe we'd rather they live on something like a service account, or at the very, very least, get shared with a service account, even if a user actually created it, right? One of the governance rules I would encourage you to put in place is if it's a critical workflow, it should be made on a service account. If it can't be, then whoever made it had better share it with a service account and make sure they renamed their actions and maybe even documented what the flow is doing so an IT department or whoever else can come through and actually maintain that workflow.
Yeah. So
Another good governance tip, just look up here at this name, right? I have it. I have the name of the workflow. Then I have a little version indicator, and I tell people that this is an active workflow, right? Because while there is some versioning for solution flows, and that's a whole different topic for another day, most of the workflows you're going to make don't support versioning. So you'll have to get into the pattern of doing that yourself.
yeah. So those are some really good things. All right. Awesome. So let's go ahead and go back over because of time. Let's go ahead and switch back over, and we'll talk about integration with some other Office 365 apps. And go ahead to the next slide. And Kelsey, why don't we let you just, because of time, you pick maybe one or two of these, and we'll tell you some use cases that we found for them. So you can just randomly pick whatever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think a lot of people probably use it every day, multiple times a day. What about Teams? What's possible with Teams?
Sure, sure.
Sure.
So you saw earlier, right, that when I was making some of those Power Automate workflows, they could talk to Teams. They could be triggered from Teams. They could actually send messages to Teams. They can interact with all the different pieces of Teams. But what about Power Apps? So I'll give you an example of what we actually have set up ourselves, right? It's a PTO app, right? A place we can go in Teams using a Power App to figure out how much leave balance we have, submit new leave requests, and have those get approved by the right people. That's a very common need, right? For apps like that to live inside of Teams, because Teams is where we like to work.
Awesome. I will tell you another use case that we built for a client, which was they kept their time tracking per project. So when a member of their team put time against a project, they needed a place to log all of that. They weren't a gigantic team, so they didn't want to buy like one of the very expensive third party programs. So they had a Power BI report that showed a summary of how much time was allocated to each of those projects. But they also had a Power App that was embedded inside of the Power BI report so that they could enter their time in. And then when they clicked OK, it would put that into a SharePoint list. And then the list drove the data inside of Power BI. And then they placed that entire Power BI report inside of Microsoft Teams so that their team could get to the actual report, and they just kept their tracking of time right there. And that used a whole bunch of these all in one picture, which is pretty cool.
Awesome. Okay. Well, one of my favorite ones and one that I know we love to talk about is not on this list. What about Copilot with Power Apps and Power Automate? What can we do there?
Awesome. So we'll try to wrap up everything here in this Copilot section. So those, if you have to jump off, please know that you will get the link to the video. You will also get the slide deck that we have here as well. That'll be sent.
All right. So, yeah, so not only will you be getting that video and that slide deck, as we kind of wrap things up here. But before we actually go, and anyone who can stick around for this, I think you'll get some value out of it. Let's take a look at kind of the ways that Copilot can actually interact with Power Apps and Power Automate, particularly how we can actually use Copilot to create a Power App. So I'll just quickly take us over here to Power Apps, and over here on the Create screen, right? I'll just go down to the home page. What you'll find when you're looking at the Power Platform, right, whether it's Power Apps, Power Automate, or other pieces, is Copilot is pretty central. So right here in the middle of the screen, I've got a place where I can actually go ahead and prompt Copilot to build an app for me. So one of those needs we talked about earlier was something like a facilities maintenance app. So why don't I just go ahead and put in a good prompt to go ahead and spin up a facilities maintenance app for us. So I'll tell it I'd like to create a facilities maintenance app. We'll tell it a little bit more about what we want to actually have happen in that app as well. So users should be able to submit tickets in the app, and that ticket will be stored in SharePoint. If the user is from facilities, they can see all tickets in the app. All right. So one thing to note here is that this place where we can actually prompt Copilot to build an app for us has some restrictions on the length of the prompt. Right. So I could have typed a lot more there to try and specify further how I want the app to actually work and how I want it to be laid out. But because of those limitations, I went ahead and just stopped typing there. So one more thing to note is what this really does for us first. So here, it understands the basic needs of a facilities maintenance app, right? We'll probably need to track ticket IDs, who submitted it, a description, maybe the department they were from. Well, for the submitter who submitted that ticket, it's only tracking their first name right now. Maybe I also want it to track their email. So one of the cool things to note here, right, is that we can actually iterate on what it's doing for us by talking to Copilot a little further. I'll just tell it, track the submitter's email. And what that's going to do is it's going to think about that, and it'll end up actually adding in a new field here to this table that it's going to use to understand the data. So if I click Create App, that'll go ahead and it'll think about it for a little bit. It'll go ahead and spin up this Power App for me. Again, very easy to do, very easy to use. Even this Copilot integration is something that's intended to be low code or no code. I don't have to understand app development at all to tell Copilot what I wanted there.
Yep.
Well, we've
And
also oh, go ahead,
I think
Jared.
some of the important things that are there is that you have to understand how Microsoft developed this as well. Like we talked about this earlier, Tavon. Making sure that you understand that we're really having a conversation with Copilot. That's the way all the Copilots are. We're having a conversation with them along the way. So maybe it doesn't get exactly what you were looking for right 100% the first time, but then you continue to talk to it and prompt it to do things, and then it continues along the journey and gets you to the place where you want to be at. So we expect to see this mature over time and allow for more input around the board, but for the most part, think of it as a conversation with a developer who's building your app. And again, that's something we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And notice here, when I came to the app, the first thing that it put in my face was Copilot, where we can have it create, change, remove, whatever. We can just talk to Copilot to keep expanding on this app. All right, so before we talk about what it actually built and some of the things that it might have done well or might not have, why don't we preview this app and see what it actually put together for us? So it has ticket tracking, right? It does in fact track these tickets, and we can click through them and we can see the different tickets that have been submitted. I can click new, and it'll actually let me add in a new ticket. But there are some things that are maybe a little weird with this, right? Things we might not have wanted when we first told Copilot what to do. For instance, maybe it's not a great idea for whoever is creating a ticket or submitting a maintenance request to have to give it a ticket ID, but it says this is required, right? Maybe that's something the app can calculate for them. A couple of other little things to note with what it actually did, right? In my prompt, I told it the data should live in SharePoint. But if I click on this data button over here, that's not SharePoint, right? Copilot really likes to start out with Dataverse as the place where it's going to store your information from one of these apps. Could I come back through and update this, take this Dataverse piece out of here and turn this into a connection to SharePoint instead? Absolutely. But it's worth knowing that you should always check Copilot's work,
Yeah, and
right?
just if you like things that are funny, we actually told it, say, hey, I don't want this to be a Dataverse. I want this to be in a SharePoint list. And it said, hey, your request is irrelevant.
Great way
And I
for them
thought,
to
well,
have worded that, huh?
that was funny. All
All
right.
right.
So for time purposes, we'll go ahead and step forward a little bit.
Awesome, awesome. So this same power as Power Apps has to create with Copilot is also present in Flow. So if I just go to the home page of Power Automate here, you'll see that it gives me some prompts that it suggests I use to have Copilot build a workflow for me. So I'll just choose one of these prompts that it suggests. When an item is made in SharePoint, send an email. All right. What this will do is it'll think about that request. It'll come up with a couple of options for you on how it thinks it should go about actually making this flow that you described. So it says, I'm going to trigger when an item's created, then I'll send an email. If we don't like that, we can say, show a different suggestion. And here it added in a step about getting your profile, right? So it can actually read who you are. So it sends the email to the right person. Let's have it create this first flow, though. When an item is created, it notifies someone with an email. I'll just say next. It'll ask me what connections to use, and I'll say create flow. All right. So the first thing to note is that nowhere in having Copilot put this together for me right off the bat did it actually ask me what SharePoint site it should be using to get this information. So this is another one of those places where you'll have to come back through and check Copilot's work, right? Because you have to set some of this yourself. I have to tell it, oh, I actually wanted you to read from the IT site and that tickets list. The other thing to note here is that if I click on the send an email, it had no idea who to send the email to. So it put in outputs from get my profile v2, my email. You might notice, though, that this flow does not actually have an action in it called get my profile. So if we were to run this flow right now, it would fail because this is not valid. It wouldn't send the email to anyone, and it couldn't figure out what it was supposed to be looking at. So again,
Yep.
you'll just want to pay pretty close attention to what Copilot builds for you with workflows.
And I think it's important that we do a lot of webinars. We show off a lot of Microsoft products, and we really kind of show them in really a good light. But I don't want you to think that Microsoft is coming to us and saying, "Hey, you guys, you got to say it this way." We're just telling you the truth, right? So this is here, but I expect it to grow up over time. It's you. I don't see in any way that Microsoft would put less invention into Copilot. They're just going to continue to improve it and improve it and improve it. So this will grow over time. Check back on it a little bit later to see how it's doing inside of the environment.
All right. So talking about Copilot and the Power Platform, there's one more piece that I want to make sure we mention for you, and that's Copilot Studio.
Yep. So if you saw our webinar on data governance inside of your Office 365 environment before turning on Copilot, if you saw that's a very important one. And part of that, what we mentioned was making sure that you're trying to control the conversation of what Copilot can actually look at. So if you just go and turn it on now, it's gonna and you ask it a question, it's gonna go out and look everywhere that you have access to, even the places where you don't know that you have access to, and it's going to bring back an answer. Even it's also going to go and look at all the old archivable information that you haven't archived yet. So all the ancient policies that you have and all that stuff that you guys thought, let's just hold on to this forever. It's going to go look at all that and put that into the answer. It's going to look at sensitive data. And if it produces something for you, like create a PowerPoint or create a Word document from this, if it generates that stuff for you, well, it's going to include that sensitive data. And you haven't told it that that data was sensitive, so that the new document should also be sensitive, right? So you haven't done any of that stuff. One of the things that can help with that, in conjunction with, say, retention inside of Microsoft Purview and sensitivity labels inside of Microsoft Purview and all those really good things that you do, right? Copilot Studio is another place where you can interact with that and help. So with Copilot Studio, I could go in and say, hey, when you're asking these questions about policies, right? And I set up a prompt for that. I could redirect it and say, hey, only consider this one library over on this one site that has all the policies in it. Don't go look at the archives. Don't go look at the old sites. Don't go look at other stuff. Just look at this one place for it. So you can kind of take over the prompt and redirect it to fine tune what the answer is going to be or where it's going to get the information for the answer. Right. But in addition to that, you could say, I also want you to go out and check our external policy holder or our HRIS system, which has maybe the employee handbook in it and other things. So you could say, here's where I want you to look for that information. And that's an important thing to be able to do. So Copilot Studio should be a part of the arsenal. I know you're looking at this pricing, you're saying, oh my gosh, $200 annual, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not that. If you already have Copilot and you're paying for it, look at the right-hand side of the screen, because that's $30 per user per month for the Copilot, which will then also give you Copilot Studio inside of there. That's the way we understand it for right now.
And one more thing to mention here, right, is not only can we control some things like where Copilot is looking, but if you saw during the portion where we were talking about triggers for Power Automate workflows, we can actually tell Copilot using Copilot Studio, hey, someone asked this kind of question, or they told you to build a project site, go ahead and run this workflow. Yeah. That can be a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, awesome stuff. So an important part of your arsenal there as you're going forward. All right, let's go to the next slide and let's go ahead and sum up some things. And so where have we been in this particular session? We try to mention several best practices along the way. We know we have a mixed crowd, so we like to be able to show all aspects of it, and hopefully we did that for you today. We looked at how you get started, and hopefully you know now where those apps are and how you can get started in very simple ways, whether it's in a list or going out to the actual tool itself. We looked at how do you use Power Apps with SharePoint to be able to enhance forms, and hopefully we gave you a little bit more information than we said we were going to give there. We looked at the types of Power Apps and their use cases. We looked at the types of Power Automate flows and their use cases. We saw a little bit about how it interacts. We kind of cut that a little bit short. We had more for you there, but we were going to run out of time. And then we took a look at Copilot also to give you an idea of how Copilot can help and where we're at right now in the Copilot experience and where we should be later in the Copilot experience. And then we talked about Copilot Studio. So I do want you to know, we're going to look at questions in just one second, but I do want you to know that we have, for those who have to jump off, we have another webinar coming up. If you can go 2 slides down there, Tavon. We have another webinar coming up called Piloting Microsoft Copilot AI, where we're going to have some in-depth demonstrations of Copilot, and we're going to talk a lot about Copilot. So definitely be there for that. You can, it'll be Thursday, July 25th, and at 11:30 Central Time. And you can find that information at spindustry.com/webinars. And if you go one more slide, Tavon, if you are here and you are going to be going to the SHRM conference, if you're in the HR world or you're in the C-suite and you're going to be going to the SHRM 24 conference next week in Chicago, stop by our booth and say hi. We're in booth 1702. I'm also giving a lecture there in the exhibit hall on Tuesday, and I have no idea what time it is. But definitely drop by our booth, grab some candy, have some conversation, and so forth. All right, so let's go over to Kelsey. And Kelsey, were there any questions that we could help with?
Yeah, absolutely. We had just a couple. So this first one came up when we were talking about SOPs. And someone was wondering, can you set the automation if you are not the owner of the SOP? Could you develop automation that applies to multiple different document pages within an intranet?
So yes, if I don't have to be the owner of any of that content in order for a workflow to interact with it, right? I just have to be able to get to that content. The workflow that I set up will run off of my permissions or whatever permissions I'm using when I build out one of those connectors for it or connections for it. As for whether a workflow can interact with multiple different libraries or different pages, the trigger is very specific, right? The trigger for a workflow likes to look at one thing and one thing only. Can the actions go across sites? Absolutely. And again, we can do things like templates and saving flows as a save as action on them. So we could easily create a second flow that triggers from a separate library, but does the same things for us.
And I think that's a good tip as well, Tavon. Instead of one giganto flow, maybe multiple flows that work together. So one flow kicks off and then starts up other flows as well. That's an advanced technique.
Awesome. Okay, another one we have is someone asked, all of these Power Automate features we talked about, are they available in our SharePoint environment right now?
So
Yes, absolutely.
I'll take. Oh, well, you'll take that.
Oh, sorry. But yes, Power Automate is something that's been in your SharePoint environment for years, right? It is all sitting there just waiting for you to take advantage of it.
And I think the difference might be per from company to company is whether your IT department turned it off or not, or hid it from you or not. But yes, it is there, and yes, it works.
Perfect. Okay, we just have time for one more then. Let's go with, is it better to use Dataverse or SharePoint List to store data for a Power App?
All right.
So,
So
okay, this is opinions. Okay, just letting you know these are opinions. Go ahead, Tavon.
so let's talk for a second then about the real difference between Dataverse and a SharePoint list, right? Dataverse, like I mentioned earlier, is intended to be a large scale database software in your environment. Right. It can have whole bunches of tables that can have entirely insane numbers of records to them, and they can all talk to each other. But that's still something that SharePoint can do, right? SharePoint has its lists. The real difference that you'll find is that Dataverse is intended for that large scale enterprise grade use where we want to pass off some of the calculation to the table instead of having it done by our workflow or app, right? It's a little bit faster when we have incredible amounts of data in a Dataverse table than it would be in SharePoint.
So
That being
I
said,
oh, go ahead.
you can jump in.
So my opinion is, having tried to work with them both, that I appreciate working with a SharePoint list more so than I appreciate working with Dataverse, right? And I know Microsoft would they like us to use Dataverse if possible, but it's additional money that I didn't have to spend in those cases that I was working on, and where the SharePoint gave me all the speed that I need and gave me everything I was looking for. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a person who goes and grabs a tool that measures how fast did this app run versus how fast did this app run. I'm just looking at it from a user perspective. I clicked the button. Did I get it back in a reasonable amount of time? And when I did that test on it, I didn't see any difference. And so for the scenarios that I was building at the time, just want to preface that, I felt that going with a SharePoint list was better and gave us better control over it. Plus, when you want someone else to interact with that data in a different way other than that application that you just built, you for Dataverse, I'd have to build another way for them to go in and use Dataverse to be able to edit that data or work with that data. Where in SharePoint, all those other ways of interacting with that data were already in place, and there was no learning curve for my users, my business users who are using that business data. So while I do recognize that speed and things like that, if it was necessary, would be better inside of Dataverse, again, I have to weigh every scenario, and all the scenarios that I've come up with so far, I appreciate working with SharePoint more. That's just Jared. That's just Jared. Don't tell Microsoft on me.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's probably all the time we have for questions. So, like Jared said, you will be receiving the recording of this webinar as well as the slides. And if you have any questions or your question didn't get answered, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there on the slides for you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.